Before we begin, if you find yourself wandering through the peculiar corridors of forgotten tales and half-remembered histories, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Here, we specialize in the kind of stories that linger in the quiet hours, the ones that make you question whether time itself is as reliable as it claims to be. Now, let us step into the first chapter of this curious tale. Chapter 1. The Curious Case of Forgotten Time. There was a leper colony on the edge of the world, or at least it felt that way to the people who lived there. It wasn't marked on most maps, and if it was, the ink had likely smudged into obscurity, as if the land itself was trying to forget. The colony was a place where time did not behave as it should. Clocks ticked, yes, but the seconds dragged like feet through wet sand. Hours stretched into what felt like days, and days dissolved into a shapeless haze, indistinguishable from one another. The residents of the colony, a small band of souls bound by circumstance and the slow creep of disease, often remarked on it. Time moves slower here, they would say, not with complaint, but with the detached curiosity of people who had long since stopped expecting answers. They were not philosophers nor scientists, just individuals who had become unwilling students of time's peculiar behavior. The colony's isolation was part of it, of course. Cut off from the bustling world beyond the cliffs and the thick, unyielding forests, the rhythms of life were dictated by the sun's grudging ascent and the moon's slow blink overhead. There were no trains to catch, no factory whistles to mark the shifts of labor, no newspapers arriving with yesterday's news. The world outside moved at its own frenetic pace, but here in this forgotten pocket, time had decided to amble. Then there was the illness itself. Leprosy, that ancient affliction, did not hurry. It took its time, settling into skin and bone with the patience of a monk at prayer. The slow erosion of sensation, the gradual numbing of limbs, the creeping march of decay, all of it unfolded in a tempo that made the passage of years feel like centuries. The body's own deterioration became a kind of clock, one that ticked not in seconds but in the quiet, irreversible losses that piled up like dust in an abandoned house. But perhaps the strangest factor was the way memory worked in the colony. The past was not so much remembered as it was relived. Conversations from decades ago were recounted with the freshness of yesterday, and events that had happened a lifetime ago still carried the weight of the present. The residents spoke of their childhoods as though they had just stepped out of them, and the faces of the long dead were as familiar as those sitting across from them at supper. In a place where the future was uncertain and often unkind, the past refused to fade. It lingered, stubborn and thick, like fog over the marshes. There was a man there named Elias, who had once been a watchmaker. He still repaired the few timepieces that found their way into the colony, though he often remarked that his work felt increasingly futile. "A clock is a lie here," he would say, holding up a half-mended pocket watch, its gears frozen in silent protest. "It tells you time is passing, but it doesn't know what time is anymore." Elias had a theory, one he shared only in fragments between long pauses and sips of bitter tea. He believed that time was not a fixed thing, but a fluid one, shaped by the weight of human experience. In places of great suffering or great joy, it stretched or contracted, like leather left out in the rain. The colony, with its slow suffering and its quiet despair, had become a place where time pooled, thick and sluggish like syrup in winter. The others humored him, though they didn't always understand. They didn't need to. They knew, in their bones, that something was different here. The sun took longer to set. The night stretched on, vast and star-filled, as if the darkness itself was reluctant to release them. Even the children, few as they were, seemed to grow older at a different pace, their faces holding on to youth just a little longer than they should. And so life in the colony continued, unhurried and heavy, a place where the hours were not counted but endured. The world beyond might rush forward, chasing progress and novelty, but here time had decided to sit a while. It was a curious thing, this forgotten corner where the clock's hands moved, but never seemed to arrive. But this was only the beginning of the story. the first whisper of a much deeper mystery. For time, as it turned out, was not just slow in the colony. It was also curiously selective. Some moments vanished like smoke, while others clung with the tenacity of a burr. And then there were the days that seemed to repeat, the conversations that echoed as though they had happened before, the uncanny sense that the colony was not just living in time, but somehow trapped within it. That, however, is a tale for another chapter. Chapter 2. Lepers and the Longest Hours. Morning in the leper colony arrived like an uninvited guest, slow, unremarkable, and impossible to ignore. The sun did not so much rise as it seeped into the sky, its light diluted by the perpetual haze that clung to the settlement. There was no fanfare, no urgency to greet the new day. Instead, the residents stirred one by one, peeling themselves from their cots as if time itself had gummed up the hinges of their joints. Breakfast was a drawn-out affair. Porridge, always porridge, cooked in a great iron pot that had long since forgotten the taste of anything else. It bubbled lethargically over the fire, its surface wrinkling like the skin of the old woman who tended it. She had been stirring the same pot for 20 years, or perhaps 30. No one could say for certain. The days had a way of collapsing into one another, and the act of counting them had come to feel as pointless as counting grains of sand. The colony's routines were etched into the bones of the place, as unchanging as the cliffs that hemmed them in. After breakfast, there was the slow procession to the infirmary, where bandages were changed with a methodical care that bordered on ritual. The nurse, a gaunt man with fingers worn smooth from decades of winding gauze, worked without speaking. He knew every wound by heart, every slow, festering sore that would never quite heal. The patients, for their part, endured the ministrations with a quiet resignation. Pain was familiar here, an old companion that had long since worn out its ability to shock. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The colony's few able-bodied residents tended to the gardens, their movements measured and deliberate. Every action was performed with the knowledge that haste served no purpose. A row of beans planted today would not sprout any faster than one planted tomorrow. Time, after all, was the one thing they had in abundance. Elias, the watchmaker, often sat on the porch of his hut, a disassembled clock spread before him like a patient on an operating table. He no longer bothered with repairs. What was the use when timekeeping had become a fiction? Instead, he tinkered out of habit, his fingers moving with the same absent precision they always had. Sometimes he would hold up a gear to the light, squinting at it as though it might reveal some secret about the nature of the hours that refused to pass. The children of the colony, few and quiet, played games that seemed to last for days. A single round of hide-and-seek could stretch from morning until dusk, the seekers wandering without urgency, the hiders dozing in their hiding spots, undisturbed. The games had no winners or losers, only participants, drifting in and out of play like shadows. Lunch, when it came, was a meager affair. Bread, sometimes cheese, always eaten in silence. Conversation was a luxury here, one that few could afford. Words had a way of dissipating in the heavy air, their meanings lost before they reached the listener's ears. It was easier to say nothing, to let the silence settle like dust over the table. The afternoons were the longest. The sun hung suspended in the sky as though it, too, had grown weary of its daily journey. The residents of the colony scattered to their usual spots, some to their cots for naps that lasted hours, others to the shade of the great oak at the center of the settlement, where they sat in wordless companionship. The oak was the colony's only true landmark, its gnarled branches a testament to the passage of years that no one could quite account for. As evening approached, the air grew cooler, but the relief was slight. The nights here were no more hurried than the days. Supper was another silent ritual, followed by the slow retreat to bed. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and shallow, punctuated by the sounds of coughing and the occasional cry of a night bird that had lost its way. In the colony, There were no deadlines, no appointments, no pressing matters to attend to. There was only the endless stretch of hours, each one indistinguishable from the last. The residents moved through them like swimmers in a stagnant pool, their progress measured in inches rather than miles. And yet, for all its sluggishness, time did pass. Fingernails grew and were trimmed. Hair turned gray and fell out. The children, though they seemed to age at a glacial pace, did eventually grow taller. The disease, relentless in its patience, continued its slow work. It was this paradox that fascinated Elias more than anything. Time was undeniably moving. The evidence was all around them. And yet it felt as though they were standing still. He often wondered if they were caught in some kind of eddy, a backwater of existence where the current of time swirled endlessly without carrying them forward. The others did not share his curiosity. To them, the dragging hours were simply a fact of life, as unremarkable as the color of the sky or the taste of the porridge. They endured as they had always endured, waiting for nothing in particular, because waiting was all there was to do. But Elias could not shake the feeling that there was something more to it, that the colony's strange relationship with time was not just a quirk of isolation, but a symptom of something deeper. He had noticed, for instance, that certain days seemed to repeat themselves. The same conversations, the same minor occurrences, as though the world had briefly stuttered. And then there were the gaps, the stretches of time that simply vanished unaccounted for, as though they had never existed at all. He kept these observations to himself. There was no use in troubling the others with questions that had no answers. Instead, he watched, and he waited, and he wondered if time, in its own inscrutable way, was trying to tell them something. Chapter 3. The Clock That Never Ticked. There had once been a clock in the leper colony. It arrived decades ago, or was it centuries? Packed in a crate of donated goods alongside moth-eaten blankets and rusted surgical tools. It was a grandfather clock, or what remained of one, its face cracked, and its pendulum missing. The townspeople, in a rare burst of optimism, propped it up in the meeting hall, where it stood like a skeletal sentinel, its hands frozen at 3:17. For years no one touched it. Then one day, a newcomer, a man who still had most of his fingers and the naive energy of someone who hadn't yet realized how time worked here, decided to fix it. He scavenged gears from broken watches, whittled a replacement pendulum out of oak, and spent 3 weeks, or possibly 3 months, coaxing the old mechanism back to life. The day it finally ticked, the entire colony gathered to watch. The sound was foreign here, a sharp, metallic intrusion into the usual silence. Tick, gas, dokdaning, beelangein, bedesigen testan de bedidig, van down. Tick. The residents stared at the moving hands with something between awe and offense. It felt unnatural, like a corpse suddenly sitting up to ask for tea. Then, inevitably, it stopped. No one knew why. The would-be repairman poked and prodded, but the clock refused to resurrect a second time. The hands settled at 9:43, and there they stayed, as if time itself had gotten bored and wandered off. The colony took this as confirmation of what they already knew. Clocks were liars. Time did not march here. It shuffled. It dozed. Occasionally, it forgot to move at all. After that, the clock became a joke. "What time is it?" someone would ask, and the answer was always the same. Time doesn't live here anymore. Children dare each other to stand too close to it, as though its brokenness might be contagious. Old man Hesketh, who had been there longer than anyone could remember, claimed the clock had stopped because it was afraid of being wrong, afraid of the way hours stretched and yawned in this place. "Clocks need certainty," he said, tapping his temple. And certainty left this place a long time ago. Elias found the whole thing darkly amusing. As a former watchmaker, he understood the arrogance of timekeeping devices. They presumed order, structure, a universe that obeyed the neat divisions of hours and minutes. But the universe had no such obligations. And neither did the colony. Here, a minute could last an hour, and an hour could evaporate like mist. A pocket watch might tick faithfully in your hand. But that didn't mean it was telling the truth. He had a small collection of broken timepieces in his hut, watches donated by well-meaning outsiders who didn't realize their uselessness. He liked to take them apart, not to fix them, but to see what had failed. It was always the same story. A snapped spring, a cracked gear, a mechanism gummed up by dust or rust. The failures were mundane. The real mystery was why anyone had expected them to work in the first place. One afternoon, or possibly morning, the light was the same either way. A traveling preacher stumbled into the colony. He was a sweaty, red-faced man carrying a Bible in one hand and a loudly ticking pocket watch in the other. He spoke of repentance, salvation, and the importance of using one's time wisely. The residents listened politely, though their expressions suggested they found the concept of using time as baffling as the idea of bottling smoke. When the preacher finished, he glanced at his watch and gasped. "This can't be right," he muttered. "I've only been speaking for 10 minutes. The crowd exchanged glances. Old man Hesketh chuckled into his beard. "It felt like an hour," someone offered. The preacher frowned, shook his watch, held it to his ear. No, it's definitely only been 10 minutes. The watch is quite reliable." Elias couldn't help himself. "Is it?" he asked. "Or is it just saying what it's supposed to say?" The preacher blinked. "Well, it's a fine Swiss mechanism." "Mechanisms don't know where they are," Elias said. "That watch thinks it's in a train station somewhere, where time has to hurry. But here, time naps." The preacher left soon after, muttering about ungodly places and the devil's tricks. The colony forgot about him before he'd even reached the tree line. The only clock that ever worked reliably in the colony was the sun, and even that was a sluggish affair. Dawn and dusk were the only reliable markers, and even they stretched or shrank, depending on the season. Or perhaps the colony's mood. Meals happened when hunger struck, sleep when exhaustion insisted. The few events that required coordination, the monthly supply cart, the occasional visit from a doctor, were met with a collective shrug. If the cart arrived late, no one minded. If the doctor didn't come at all, no one was surprised. Once, a government inspector visited, clutching a clipboard and a frown. He asked why no one kept schedules, why the infirmary had no posted hours, why the colony's single schoolhouse, a generous term for a leaky shack, operated on no discernible timetable. The residents stared at him. "Timetables?" repeated the schoolteacher, a woman missing 2 fingers and most of her patience. "What would we put on them? Math, eventually, lunch. When the bread arrives, death postponed indefinitely." The inspector left in a huff, his carefully planned schedule collapsing like a house of cards in the colony's timeless air. Elias often wondered if the absence of clocks was a blessing. Out in the world, time was a tyrant, dictating when to work, when to eat, when to sleep. Here it was more of a lazy house cat, unpredictable, occasionally absent, and entirely unconcerned with human expectations. Still, sometimes, in the quietest hours, he missed the ticking, not because he wanted time to move faster, but because he missed the illusion that it moved at all. Chapter 4. Isolation, the Great Time Warper. The leper colony existed in a bubble, not the kind that children blow for amusement, but the kind that forms when the world exhales a place from its memory. The roads leading to it had long since been reclaimed by weeds. The postman came only when the moon was in a particular phase, or when he had drunk enough to forget where he was going. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place, slipping around its edges like a thief skirting a sleeping guard. Isolation did strange things to time. Without the usual markers, the changing fashions of distant cities, the rise and fall of governments, the birth of new technologies, the years lost their edges. The residents had stopped counting them long ago. Birthdays were acknowledged only when someone happened to remember, which wasn't often. The children, when asked how old they were, would shrug and guess. The elderly had given up entirely. Older than the oak, old man Hesketh would say, though the oak itself couldn't remember being a sapling. The absence of newspapers was the first thing outsiders noticed, if they noticed anything at all. In the world beyond, headlines screamed of wars and inventions and scandals, but none of that noise reached the colony. When someone occasionally brought in a week's-old paper, the residents would pore over it with the detachment of anthropologists studying an alien culture. They've elected a new president, someone might remark, as though commenting on the mating habits of exotic birds. Then the paper would be used to kindle a fire, its urgency reduced to ashes. The lack of calendars was more subtle but just as telling. Months passed without names. Seasons came and went, but their arrivals were soft, like footsteps in snow. Winter might linger until everyone forgot there had ever been a summer, or spring might arrive so suddenly it felt like a prank. The crops grew, or didn't, at their own pace, indifferent to human schedules. Silence was the colony's true soundtrack. No church bells rang the hours. No trains whistled in the distance. Even the animals had learned to be quiet. The birds sang less here, as though afraid to interrupt the stillness. The only regular sound was the coughing, a chorus that never quite faded but never grew loud enough to demand attention. Without the usual noise of life, time had nothing to bump against, nothing to define itself by. It pooled like water in a ditch, unmoving, growing stale. Elias had once read about prisoners in solitary confinement, how they marked time by scratching lines on walls or counting heartbeats. The colony was different. No one here was counting. The walls remained unmarked, not out of despair, but because the idea of tracking days had come to seem absurd. What was the point of tallies when the sum never changed? Visitors, rare as they were, always remarked on the quiet. They would arrive full of nervous energy, their eyes darting as though expecting something to happen. When nothing did, they would fidget, check their watches, clear their throats. The residents found this amusing. "They're like wind-up toys," young Marta once observed, watching a doctor's assistant twitch through supper. All of that clicking and buzzing, and for what? The doctor's assistant left the next morning claiming he couldn't stand the stillness. The colony didn't hold it against him. Some people needed noise the way others needed air. The slowest hours were the ones after lunch, when the sun hung motionless in the sky, and even the flies grew lethargic. These were the hours when time didn't just crawl, it folded in on itself. People would sit on porches, staring at nothing, their thoughts moving in slow circles. Conversations, if they happened at all, were punctuated by long pauses, as though the words themselves were tired. "Do you think it'll rain?" someone might ask. A minute or 10 would pass. "Maybe," came the reply. Another stretch of silence. But probably not. Occasionally someone would try to break the monotony. Old man Hesketh had once organized a chess tournament, but the first game lasted 3 weeks before both players forgot whose turn it was. Marta had attempted to teach the children a clapping game, but they kept losing interest mid-clap. Even the simplest diversions, card games, storytelling, whistling, fizzled out, undone by the colony's gravitational pull toward inertia. The night was no better. Without street lamps or even many candles, darkness fell like a curtain, and sleep was a fickle guest. Some nights it came quickly. Others it wandered in and out, leaving the residents in a foggy limbo between waking and dreams. It was during these stretches that time became truly untrustworthy. A man might close his eyes for what felt like minutes only to find the sun rising. Another might lie awake for what seemed like hours, only for the clock, the broken one, still stuck at 9:43, to mock him with the truth. Only 10 minutes had passed. The worst part, Elias sometimes thought, wasn't that time moved slowly. It was that it moved unevenly. A morning could drag like a wounded animal, only for the afternoon to vanish before anyone noticed. Days collapsed into each other, indistinguishable as pebbles in a stream. Weeks passed in a blur, except for certain moments. A particularly vivid sunset, a sudden downpour that stretched like taffy, lingering far longer than they should. The colony's isolation wasn't just physical, it was temporal. They weren't just cut off from the world, they were cut off from its sense of time. Out there, minutes were currency, spent and hoarded and traded. Here, they were leaves on a pond, drifting where the current took them. Elias often wondered if this was what eternity felt like, not an endless stretch, but a single, endless moment. He didn't share this thought with the others. They already knew. They lived it every day, in the silence, in the stillness, in the slow, unyielding crawl of hours that refused to pass. And yet, for all its weight, time did move. The children grew, though no one could say how much. The oak tree added rings, though no one was counting. Even the disease, that slowest of all thieves, continued its work, carving its marks into flesh and bone. The colony endured, as it always had. And time, that most indifferent of jailers, kept its own counsel. Chapter 5. The Slow Dance of Decay. Leprosy worked at two speeds, both equally cruel in their own way. Flesh could melt away with startling swiftness, a fingertip vanishing between one morning and the next, like a candle stub burning down. Yet the disease also moved with glacial patience, taking years to nibble its way through a foot or gnaw at the cartilage of a nose. This created the colony's great irony. While bodies deteriorated in fits and starts, time itself moved with the sluggish determination of a snail crossing a vast desert. The infirmary walls bore witness to this paradox. The medicine cabinet contained bandages yellowed with age next to freshly oozing wounds. The shelves held jars of salves that had thickened to the consistency of tar while waiting to be used, while outside the window, new lesions bloomed on skin with the suddenness of mushrooms after rain. Dr. Velshi, who wasn't actually a doctor but had played one longer than anyone could remember, liked to say they were fighting a war where the enemy used both blitzkrieg and siege tactics while they were armed only with damp cloths and resignation. Young Tomas provided the most striking example. His right hand had remained unchanged for nearly 3 years, a minor miracle that made him the colony's best at threading needles and repairing fishing nets. Then one Tuesday, or possibly Wednesday, the distinction meant little. He woke to find his pinky finger hanging by a thread of gristle, as though his body had suddenly remembered an unfinished chore. The finger fell into his porridge that same afternoon, while the clock on the wall, still obstinately displaying 9:43, looked on indifferently. Meanwhile, old man Hesketh's decline followed the disease's more typical meandering path. His left foot had been surrendering inch by inch for a decade, the flesh receding slower than a timid tide. Each morning he would examine the progress with the detached interest of a geologist studying erosion. Another millimeter gone, he might remark over breakfast as casually as another man might comment on the weather. The process was slow enough that he could chart his decay against other mundane events. His little toe disappeared around the same time the well needed repairing. His arch collapsed about when young Marta started walking. This uneven decay created peculiar challenges. The colony's cobblers, themselves missing various digits, struggled to make shoes that accommodated feet in varying states of departure. They developed a specialty in what they darkly called anticipatory footwear, boots with extra room in the toes and clever lacing systems that could be adjusted as the wearer diminished. The cobbler's ledger contained measurements that tracked like morbid bar graphs. Hesketh, left foot. June 23 cm, September 22, 0.7 cm, December 22. Pre-slow numerical countdown to nothingness. Mealtimes showcased another cruel juxtaposition. Food took forever to prepare. Vegetables required endless peeling by hands with dwindling fingers, Bread needed extra kneading time as weakened arms tired quickly. Yet once served, it often went cold before being eaten, as diners struggled to bring utensils to mouths with trembling, numbed hands. The soup in particular became a test of patience, its steam rising in lazy curls as spoonful after spoonful slipped back into the bowl, the distance from table to lips apparently growing longer each day. The children, as children do, found humor in this grim reality. They played a game called What's Missing, where they'd examine each other's bandages and try to guess what new piece might be absent underneath. The winner wasn't who guessed correctly. There were no correct guesses in the colony, but who came up with the most creative suggestion. "I bet it's your whole thumb," little Jory once crowed to Thomas, who laughed so hard he nearly knocked over his mug. An impressive feat given how slowly everything moved. Elias observed all this with his watchmaker's eye, noting how the disease respected neither symmetry nor schedule. He'd seen faces where one side collapsed like rotten fruit, while the other remained untouched for years. He knew men who could still thread a needle despite missing 3 fingers, and others who couldn't hold a cup though their hands appeared intact. The only predictable thing about leprosy was its unpredictability, a fact that made the glacial pace of daily life all the more ironic. Even death moved at these 2 speeds here. Some residents faded over years, shrinking bit by bit, until they simply didn't wake one morning. Others departed with shocking suddenness, here for breakfast, gone by supper, as though their bodies had finally remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere. The graveyard reflected this dichotomy, its headstones bearing dates spaced years apart right next to ones separated by mere days. No pattern, no rhythm, just the slow dance of decay and its occasional frenzied pirouettes. Yet for all the disease's capriciousness, the colony endured. Hands still found ways to work even as fingers vanished. Faces still smiled even as lips thinned. Life continued its stubborn march, even as time dragged its feet and bodies fell apart piece by piece. There was a strange comfort in this contradiction, the knowledge that while flesh might fail unpredictably, the sun would still rise and set at its own leisurely pace, the crops would grow in their own sweet time, and the broken clock would forever read 9:43, a monument to the colony's warped relationship with time and decay. A monument to the colony's warped relationship with time and decay. Chapter 6. Monastic Time versus Leper Time. The monastery stood 12 miles from the leper colony, though the distance might as well have been measured in centuries rather than leagues. Where the colony sprawled in lazy disarray, the monastery rose in stern, geometric precision. Its walls straight, its corners sharp, its very stones seeming to chide the world for its messiness. The monks within lived by the iron rule of the horarium, their days divided into neat portions like a carefully sliced loaf. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning. Each office called the faithful to prayer with the same unyielding certainty as the turning of the stars. Time, in the monastery, was a well-oiled machine, its gears meshing perfectly, its hands sweeping forward without hesitation. The leper colony had no such machinery. When Brother Anselm first visited the colony, sent by his abbot to deliver a cask of wine and a basket of yesterday's bread, he arrived clutching a small sand timer, as though expecting the place to be entirely devoid of temporal measurement. He was a young man, his tonsure still fresh, his sandals still stiff with newness. His eyes darted about the settlement with poorly concealed alarm, lingering on the slumped postures and missing digits, the faces half consumed by the disease. He cleared his throat and announced, with the careful enunciation of someone speaking to simpletons or foreigners, that he had come bearing alms from the Abbey of St. Jerome. May God bless and keep you all. The residents accepted the gifts with quiet thanks, though several exchanged glances at the sand timer, which Brother Anselm kept flipping with nervous regularity. "You keep track of the hours?" Elias asked, nodding at the device. "Of course," said Brother Anselm, puffing up slightly. We observe the canonical hours with perfect regularity. The day must be ordered, for disorder is the enemy of devotion. Elias considered this. What happens if you're late? Brother Anselm blinked. One isn't late. The horarium is absolute. But if you were? The monk's fingers twitched against his robe. The divine office does not wait for man. If a brother misses prime, he must make penance. If he misses vespers, he must. He stopped, realizing the absurdity of explaining monastic discipline to a gathering of lepers, some of whom were missing enough fingers to make the counting of prayers difficult. Old man Hesketh chuckled into his beard. Out here, time's more of a suggestion. This seemed to distress Brother Anselm profoundly. But without order, how do you know when to pray? When to work? When to rest? The residents exchanged glances. Work happened when there was work to be done. Rest happened when exhaustion demanded it. Prayer? Well, prayer was a private matter, conducted in silence, or not at all. No one rang bells to announce it. "We manage," said Marta, who had once been a nun before the spots on her skin made convent life untenable. Brother Anselm's sant timer ran out. With a small compulsive twitch he flipped it over. The grains began their slow descent once more. The monk stayed the afternoon, though he refused the offered meal, citing dietary restrictions that no one in the colony had the means or inclination to accommodate. As the hours stretched, his initial stiffness gave way to a kind of horrified fascination. He watched as Tomas attempted to whittle a spoon, a task that should have taken 20 minutes but had already consumed most of the day. He observed the infirmary, where Dr. Velshi changed bandages with a leisurely thoroughness that would have sent the monastery's infirmarian into apoplexy. Most disturbing of all, he noticed the colony's complete indifference to his sand timer, which he continued to flip with increasing desperation as the sky darkened at its own unhurried pace. As evening fell, or rather, as it slumped lazily into place, Brother Anselm prepared to leave. His fingers trembled slightly as he packed away his timer. "Don't you feel it?" he burst out suddenly. The weight of all this nothingness, the endlessness." Hesketh scratched his nose. "What remained of it? You get used to it. But time is a gift from God. To waste it is easier when you've got plenty to spare," finished Marta, with the dry tone of someone who had once said similar things to wayward novices. Brother Anselm left soon after, his sand timer clutched like a talisman against the colony's temporal malaise. The residents watched him go, his steps quick and precise against the dirt path, his robe fluttering with purpose. He moved like a man who believed in deadlines. Later, Elias found the monk's abandoned sand timer, not dropped, but placed deliberately on a fence post, as though its owner couldn't bear to bring it back to the monastery contaminated by the colony's aimlessness. The glass was clean, the wood polished, the sand inside a perfect golden heap. Elias picked it up and turned it over. The grains slipped through the narrow neck, smooth and unhurried. He let it run out. Then, on impulse, he didn't flip it. The monks would never understand. To them, time was a river to be harnessed, channeled, directed toward God. But the colony knew the truth. Time was a swamp, still and depthless, and they were all just wading through it. Somewhere in the distance, the monastery bells rang for compline, their tones crisp across the evening air. In the colony, no one marked the hour. The night would come when it came. The sand timer sat motionless, its purpose forgotten, its measured existence irrelevant in a place where time had long since given up on keeping track. Chapter 7. Boredom. The ultimate chronophage. Boredom in the leper colony was not the fleeting restlessness of a rainy afternoon, or the impatient tapping of fingers while waiting for a tardy guest. It was an all-consuming entity, thick as the humid air, heavy as the unmoving afternoons. It settled into bones and marrow, becoming so familiar that residents no longer noticed its weight. Only the way time seemed to dissolve in its presence, leaving behind a hollow expanse of hours that neither began nor ended, but simply where. The morning started with the same sluggish predictability. Eyes opened, not to greet the day, but to endure it. Bodies rolled from pallets with the enthusiasm of stones tumbling down a shallow slope. The act of dressing, for those who still bothered, took on the quality of a ritual performed without belief, fingers fumbling at buttons and ties as though they'd forgotten their purpose. Breakfast was eaten not out of hunger, but because it was something to do, the porridge's blandness a perfect mirror for the day's blankness. Conversation, when it occurred, was a half-hearted exchange of words that had been spoken 100 times before. Think it'll rain? Could. Suppose so? Neil said Hans. The wind, if it blew at all, did so without conviction. Clouds drifted past like indifferent spectators. Even the flies seemed bored, lazily circling the same patches of air before settling back where they'd started. Children who in other places might have filled the hours with games or mischief sat listlessly in the dirt, poking sticks at nothing in particular. Their toys, a frayed rope, a deflated ball, a handful of pebbles, lay untouched. Imagination required energy, and energy was in short supply. One afternoon, young Jory spent 3 hours watching an ant crawl across his shoe, not out of fascination, but because looking away would have required more effort than he could muster. Work, that great distraction of healthier men, was a rare and sporadic thing. The gardens needed tending, but the plants grew as lethargically as everything else, their progress imperceptible from one day to the next. Repairs to the crumbling huts were begun with good intentions and abandoned halfway through, when the pointlessness of it all became unbearable. Even the simplest tasks, mending a shirt, chopping wood, drawing water, stretched into minor epics of procrastination. A man might pick up a hammer, stare at it for an hour, and then set it down again, defeated by the sheer enormity of deciding where to strike. The infirmary was the worst. There, boredom festered alongside wounds. Patients lay in rows, their bandages unchanged for days. Why rush when tomorrow would be just as long? Their eyes fixed on the ceiling's water stains as though they might eventually form some interesting pattern. Dr. Velshi made his rounds with the speed of a man walking through syrup, pausing occasionally to prod at a sore or adjust a dressing, but even his motions lacked urgency. Pain was dull here, an old acquaintance rather than a sharp surprise. Elias had once tried to combat the monotony by cataloging the colony's few books, a waterlogged Bible, a cookbook missing its final chapters, and a romance novel so thoroughly mildewed that the lovers' names had dissolved into illegibility. The project had lasted 2 days before he abandoned it, defeated not by the difficulty of the task but by the crushing realization that no one would ever care about the results. Games were proposed and then forgotten. Marta attempted to organize a storytelling circle, but the tales petered out after a few sentences, the tellers losing interest in their own narratives. Someone found a deck of cards with 5 missing, but after an hour of trying to remember the rules to anything, the deck was left on a windowsill to warp in the damp. The only activity that held any appeal was staring. At walls, at the sky, at the distant tree line where the world supposedly continued without them. Eyes glazed over, thoughts slowed to a trickle, and the hours oozed past like honey from a jar. Waiting was the colony's true occupation, though no one could have said what they were waiting for. The monthly supply cart brought little excitement. The same sacks of flour, the same bars of soap, the same tins of unidentifiable meat. Visitors were rare and usually disappointing, their discomfort and hurried departures only emphasizing the colony's isolation. Even death, when it came, was less an event than a slow fading, noted with the same mild acknowledgement as a change in the weather. The worst part was how boredom warped memory. Days merged seamlessly, indistinguishable as grains of sand. A week-old conversation felt like yesterday. Something that had happened a month ago might as well have been a year. Time didn't just slow, it dissolved. Residents forgot their own ages, The year, sometimes even the season. The past and present, blurred into a single, endless nov. Occasionally someone would try to rebel against the monotony. Old man Hesketh once announced he was going to walk to the nearest town, a journey of miles he had no hope of completing. He made it as far as the colony's edge before sitting down, staring at the path ahead, and then turning back. The thought of all that empty road, all those unchanging footsteps, was simply too exhausting. By evening, the weight of the day's nothingness pressed down like a physical force. Sleep should have been a relief, but even dreams were dull here. Foggy, half-formed things that slipped away upon waking, leaving no impression behind. Nights stretched or contracted without logic, the darkness outside no more or less endless than the daylight had been. And so life continued, not in chapters or even paragraphs, but in a single unbroken sentence that no one could be bothered to finish. The residents of the colony waited without knowing what they waited for, bored without realizing how bored they were, their lives measured not in moments, but in the slow, steady chewing of time by the great, insatiable maw of nothingness. Elias sometimes wondered if this was what eternity felt like. Not fire and brimstone, but this endless, featureless plain of water. Later would turn to never soon enough. Until then, there was only the waiting, the staring, the crushing, relentless boredom that made hours feel like years and years feel like nothing at all. Chapter 8. The year that lasted a decade. Old man Hesketh claimed to remember the winter of 22. Not the year, just 22, as if the century didn't matter. He said it lasted 3 years at least, though the calendar insisted on 12 months. The snow fell so slowly that individual flakes seemed to hang suspended in the air. The icicles that formed along the eaves grew downward at the pace of a man's fingernails. You could mark your height against them as a child, and return a decade later to find they'd barely crept past your knees. The cold seeped into everything. Porridge froze between the pot and the bowl. Breath crystallized in the air and hung there like suspended curses. Hesketh swore he once saw a cough freeze midair, the particles glittering like tiny diamonds before shattering on the floor. Time didn't just slow that winter, it fractured. Days split into 100 identical fragments, each one a perfect replica of the last, until even memories couldn't tell them apart. Marta remembered her first year in the colony differently. Not by seasons, but by bandages. The way the linen unraveled in slow motion from her fingers, each loop around her wrist taking what felt like hours. The way the doctor's scissors hovered interminably before each cut. She could still recall the exact number of threads in the ceiling above her cot, 3/72, counted during endless afternoons when the shadows refused to move across the floor. That year stretched like taffy in her memory, long strands of identical days that somehow never snapped. For Tomas, the endless year came later. The summer he turned 16, or maybe 17, no one kept track, when the heat pressed down like a physical weight and the air thickened to syrup. He tried to carve a flute from river reed, a project that should have taken an afternoon but consumed months. The knife moved through the green stalks like they were ironwood. Shavings curled away with dreamlike lethargy. By the time he finished, if he ever truly did, the reed had dried and cracked, rendering the whole endeavor pointless. That summer still haunted his dreams, the way the sun stood still at its zenith for hours, how the sweat dripped down his spine, one excruciating drop at a time. The children had their own endless year, the one where they attempted to dig a hole to the other side of the world. The pit never grew deeper than 3 feet, but in their memories they'd labored for decades. Their small hands remembered each shovelful of dirt as an epic undertaking, the grains of soil hanging in the air before tumbling back into the void. The whole became a fixture of the colony, filling with rainwater that evaporated at the speed of spilled dreams. Elias measured his longest year, not in seasons, but in the crumbling of his last pocket watch. He brought it with him to the colony, a fine Swiss mechanism that had kept perfect time in his previous life. Here, its gears gradually gummed up with the damp until each tick stretched into a labored groan. The minute hand quivered but refused to advance. That final year of the watch's life passed in excruciating slow motion, the brass corroding at a visible pace, the mainspring unwinding one stubborn coil per eternity. When it finally stopped for good, Elias didn't mark the date. There was no point. The watch had been dying for a lifetime. Even the disease played tricks with time. Residents spoke of watching their own bodies change with glacial inevitability. A fingernail turning opaque over what felt like years. A toe blackening in slow, meticulous stages, as if the rot itself couldn't be bothered to hurry. Pain arrived in slow waves that never quite crested, each throbbing moment stretching into the next without relief. The colony's collective memory held these elongated years like flies in amber. 1783, when the well ran dry and every water bucket seemed to take a lifetime to fill. 1809, when the same argument about potato planting techniques repeated daily for what felt like a century. 1852, when the roof of the meeting hall leaked in exactly the same spot for 12 continuous months, each drip echoing through infinite afternoons. The years blurred together at the edges, their boundaries porous. Residents spoke of events from different decades as though they'd happened back to back. A wedding might be recalled as following immediately after a funeral that had actually occurred 10 years prior. Births, deaths, the rare moments of joy, all floated in the same vast ocean of time, unmoored from calendars or clocks. Visitors from the outside world marveled at this temporal distortion. But that couldn't have taken so long. They'd protest when told how many seasons it took to rebuild the chicken coop, or how many years had been consumed by waiting for a particular apple tree to bear fruit. The residents would simply shrug. Time moved differently here. A year could be a decade. A decade could be a lifetime. And lifetimes, well, those stretched on forever. The colony's graveyard told the true story. Dates on headstones often contradicted the residents' memories. A man might swear his wife had been gone for 30 years, when the stone clearly said 5. Children remembered as ancient souls turned out to have died in their teens. The earth held the truth, but even it seemed uncertain. Weathering made some markers illegible, while others sank slowly into the ground at uneven rates, as if time itself couldn't decide how quickly they should disappear. Elias sometimes wondered if they were all wrong, if the years hadn't actually been longer, but their perception had stretched them like taffy. Maybe time moved normally outside their borders, and it was only the weight of their isolation that made minutes feel like hours, hours like days. But then he'd look at the faces around him, at the deep creases that seemed too numerous for any earthly lifespan, at the eyes that had witnessed too many unchanging sunrises, and he'd know the truth. Here, in this forgotten place, years really did last decades, and no amount of counting could make them pass any faster. Chapter 9. Festivals that came too soon. The harvest festival always arrived like an uninvited guest. One moment, the colony would be slogging through the eternal present, each day indistinguishable from the last, and suddenly, without warning, someone would notice the apples ripening or the pumpkins swelling, and the terrible realization would sweep through the settlement. It was time again. It was time again. How can it be harvest already? Old man Hesketh would grumble, squinting at the orchard, as if the trees were playing a trick. We just had harvest. But the records didn't lie. The tattered almanac nailed to the meeting hall wall showed the same date it always did this time of year. The residents would leaf through previous years, entries with growing dismay, counting the pages between festivals, each one proof that 12 months had somehow slipped by while they weren't looking. Preparations took on a frantic, disbelieving quality. The same decorations were pulled from storage, faded garlands that seemed barely used, candles that had melted only slightly since their last lighting. The same recipes were consulted with fresh surprise. Did we really use that much nutmeg last time? Marta would ask, even as her hands measured out the familiar amounts. The colony moved through these rituals like sleepwalkers, half convinced they were recreating a dream. Children felt it most acutely. Little Jory once burst into tears when told to practice the same flute song he'd performed at the previous year's festival. "But I just learned this," he wailed, though his fingers remembered every note. The adults exchanged glances. For the children, time played a different trick. The years rushed by while the days crawled, leaving them suspended in a paradox of endless childhoods that somehow accumulated birthdays at alarming rates. The winter solstice celebration was worse. The longest night of the year should have been a reprieve from the colony's sluggish tempo, but instead it arrived with alarming frequency. One moment the residents would be complaining about the endless summer heat, blinking through sweat as they fanned themselves with limp hands, and then, without any perceptible autumn, the first frost would glitter on the grass and the carol books would reappear as if by magic. "Wasn't it just midsummer?" Tomas would ask, rubbing his arms against the sudden chill. "Last week, I thought," Elias would mutter, though the almanac showed otherwise. The feast preparations took days that felt like hours. The kneading of dough, the slow roasting of meats, the grinding of spices, all these tasks that should have dragged instead vanished in a blur, leaving the cooks blinking at finished dishes they barely remembered making. The candles burned down too quickly. The stories told around the fire ended before their listeners had settled properly into the rhythm of them. And then, impossibly, it was over. The decorations packed away with unsettling haste, as if the festival itself was in a hurry to be gone. Spring's festival was the cruelest. The celebration of first blooms arrived with malicious punctuality, catching the colony unprepared year after year. The residents would be hunched in their winter stupor, barely noticing the lengthening days, when suddenly the meadow would explode with flowers that hadn't been buds the day before. "I swear these blooms come earlier every year," Marta would say, cutting armfuls of daffodils that had seemingly sprouted overnight. "They don't," Elias would reply, checking the almanac for the 100th time. "We just forget to watch for them." The maypole went up in a daze. Dancers moved through their routines with the vague sense they'd performed these same steps recently. Children wove ribbons and patterns they somehow remembered perfectly despite having just learned them. The whole celebration had the quality of a recurring dream, familiar yet surprising, comforting yet unsettling in its déjà vu. Only the disease kept its own calendar. Anniversaries of diagnoses were remembered with unwanted clarity. The day a finger fell off, the morning a particular lesion appeared. These milestones stuck in memory, while happy occasions blurred together. The body's decay became the only reliable measure of time's passage, a grim counterpoint to the festivals that came too soon. Visitors from outside marveled at this phenomenon. "But you've only been here 3 years," a traveling physician once said to a resident who spoke of decades in the colony. The resident had simply shrugged. Time moved differently here. The years rushed by even as the days oozed like honey. Elias kept trying to solve the puzzle. He noted the dates of each festival in his journal, comparing them to previous years, searching for discrepancies. But the numbers never lied. The festivals came exactly when they should, regular as clockwork, had any clocks worked properly in the colony. The distortion was entirely in perception. The endless days somehow accumulated into fleeting years, leaving the residents perpetually off balance, always preparing for celebrations they weren't ready to have again. By the time the harvest festival decorations were stored away each year, the apples were already forming on the trees again. The children's festival garments barely had time to air out before being needed once more. The same jokes were told. Did you hear the one about the leper and the priest? The same toasts made to better health. Ha! The same songs sung slightly off-key, all with the eerie sense of repetition, even as the almanac insisted these were annual events. The colony moved through its festivals like a man walking against a strong wind, each step requiring tremendous effort, yet somehow covering no ground at all. The years blew past even as the minutes dragged, leaving everyone breathless and bewildered, forever celebrating holidays that always arrived too soon. Chapter 10. The Paradox of Painful Time. Pain stretched moments into eternities. When Tomas's finger began its slow separation from his hand, each heartbeat lasted an hour. The throbbing radiated outward in slow concentric waves, each pulse marking another eternity in what should have been passing seconds. He watched the swelling progress with the detached fascination of a man observing continental drift, the skin turning colors no healthy flesh should achieve, the joint loosening its grip on existence with excruciating reluctance. 3 days passed between the first twinge and the final snap of connective tissue, yet in memory condensed into a single instant. A sharp breath, a quiet pop, and suddenly his hand was lighter. Marta knew this paradox well. The morning her left eye, clouded over, had unfolded with unbearable slowness. First came the itch, maddening in its persistence, followed by the gradual dimming of vision, as if someone were slowly drawing a curtain across the world. She counted each minute of that creeping blindness, certain the process must be taking weeks, yet now she could recall nothing between the first irritation and the moment she realized she'd never see clearly from that eye again. The pain had been infinite while it lasted, yet vanished from memory like water into sand. Old man Hesketh's feet told the same story. Decades of slow decay had left them nearly shapeless, the toes long since departed, the arches collapsed into flat, leathery pads. Each new stage of deterioration had arrived with agonizing ceremony, the first numbness like cold molasses pouring through his veins, the subsequent ulcers opening like slow-blooming flowers, the occasional sharp jabs of phantom pain from digits that no longer exist. Yet when he looked back, all those years of suffering condensed into a handful of significant moments. The day he stopped feeling pebbles underfoot, the morning he needed help tying his shoes for the last time, the rainy season when his left heel finally surrendered to rot. The colony's infirmary was a temple to this temporal contradiction. Dr. Velshi changed dressings with methodical patience, knowing full well that for the patient beneath his hands, each second of cleansing burned like a minute, each torn bandage stuck like an hour of peeling skin. Yet weeks later, those same patients would speak of their treatments as brief interruptions in the endless tedium, their memories helpfully collapsing the agony into manageable patterns. "Remember when your foot had to be scraped?" one might ask another. "That was awful," the other would reply, as though summarizing a bad afternoon rather than a month of torment. Elias observed these peculiarities with his watchmaker's precision. Pain, he noted, warped time like a flawed mind spring, stretching it unbearably in the moment, then snapping it back to nothing in recollection. The phenomenon fascinated him. He began keeping notes on his own minor ailments, timing how long a stubbed toe actually hurt versus how long it felt, comparing the objective crawl of the sundial's shadow against his subjective experience of discomfort. The results were always the same. Suffering expanded present moments even as it collapsed past ones. The nights provided the clearest examples. A toothache could transform the dark hours into an endless plain of misery, each pulse of pain marking another mile in an apparently infinite journey toward dawn. Yet come morning, the sleepless night would already be shrinking in memory, its duration compressing like a deflating bellows. By noon, it seemed no longer than any other night. By supper, barely worth mentioning. Children adapted to this temporal paradox with eerie ease. Little Jory could scream bloody murder over a splinter's removal, his wails making the procedure seem to last hours, only to be playing happily moments later as though no time had passed at all. His tears evaporated faster than morning dew, leaving no trace in his memory of how interminable the experience had felt while it lasted. The adults watched this with equal parts envy and unease. The young forgot pain so effortlessly, while for the old, suffering accumulated like dust in corners, unnoticed until it formed visible piles. Even the disease itself followed these rules. The initial lesions appeared suddenly in memory, though their actual emergence had been painstakingly slow. The first numbness seemed in retrospect to have arrived all at once, though it had crept in millimeter by millimeter over months. Only when looking at newcomers, seeing their dawning horror as they noticed their first patches of deadened skin, did the long-term residents remember how slowly their own afflictions had truly progressed. The supply cart's monthly visits provided the strangest examples of this temporal distortion. The week before its arrival stretched endlessly, each day heavier than the last, the waiting an almost physical wait. Yet the cart's actual visit passed in a blur, the unpacking, the distribution, the brief exchange of news all compressed into a memory that felt seconds long. By the time the cart had disappeared down the road, its departure already seemed distant, the next month's wait simultaneously beginning and feeling interminable. This paradox reached its zenith with major injuries. When young Livia fell from the apple tree and broke her arm, the moment of impact stretched into a small eternity. The crack of bone echoing endlessly, the scream hanging in the air like a physical object, the scramble to help her moving through molasses. Yet the subsequent month of healing vanished almost instantly in recollection. The daily adjustments, the gradual lessening of pain, all condensing into a single impression of the time her arm was broken. Elias noticed something peculiar about shared suffering. When several residents endured the same discomfort, a particularly brutal winter, a week of spoiled food, their memories aligned more closely with objective time. The shared experience created a kind of temporal anchor, preventing the usual collapsing of painful memories. This explained why the colony could recall exactly how long the Great Fever had lasted, 3 weeks, while being utterly unreliable about individual ailments. Suffering alone stretched and compressed time. Suffering together kept it measured. As the years passed, this temporal paradox became its own kind of comfort. The current pain might feel eternal, but experience had taught them it would shrink in memory. The bandage change that seemed to last hours would be forgotten by supper. The throbbing joint would cease its complaints and leave no mark on their recollection of the day. Even the disease's progression, so agonizingly slow in the moment, would in retrospect seem to have happened all at once. Only death resisted this rule. The days leading up to a passing dragged interminably for all involved, and unlike other suffering, these final hours refused to compress in memory. Each rasping breath, each dimming glance, each weakening pulse remained etched in perfect, prolonged detail. Perhaps, Elias mused, this was why the colony feared death less than outsiders assumed, not because the pain was less, but because their peculiar relationship with time meant suffering rarely lingered in memory as long as it lasted in life. The greatest irony was that this very phenomenon made their condition bearable. If every moment of discomfort had remained as large in memory as it felt in the present, the accumulated weight would have crushed them long ago. Instead, their minds performed this merciful alchemy, transforming leaden hours into featherlight memories, making the unbearable passage of time survivable by ensuring none of it stayed too heavy for too long. Even as he documented these observations, Elias knew his notes would never capture the full strangeness of it. Words couldn't convey how a throbbing tooth could make a minute last forever, while simultaneously ensuring that forever would be forgotten by morning. The paradox existed in the living of it, this endless dance between interminable present and vanishing past, this cruel trick of time that somehow made suffering both endless and ephemeral. The colony moved through their painful days with this unspoken understanding that whatever hurt now wouldn't hurt in memory, that time stretched and compressed not by the clock's measure but by the body's, and that this was perhaps the only mercy their disease had ever granted them. Chapter 11. Guardians of Eternal Now. Father Rinaldo's pocket watch ticked with military precision, a sound as foreign to the colony as church bells in a heathen land. Each click of the mechanism cut through the thick air like a knife through porridge, marking seconds that actually passed in proper 60 to a minute increments. The priest checked it constantly, as if afraid time might slip away from him the moment his attention wandered. The lepers watched this ritual with bemused detachment, exchanging glances whenever he sighed at the hour, as though the very concept still held meaning here. The priest had arrived from Rome via Lisbon, a journey he described in precise chronological terms. 18 days at sea, 3 weeks recovering from mal de mer, 2 days by carriage to reach the colony. He spoke of dates and deadlines with reverence, crossing himself whenever mentioning feast days as though afraid of forgetting one. His breviary fell open to the correct psalms each morning without fail, its pages marked by ribbons in liturgical colors that corresponded to some celestial schedule the colony had long since stopped observing. His first Sunday Mass stretched into eternity. The lepers shifted uncomfortably on the makeshift pews as the Latin droned on, each prayer lasting exactly as long as it should, and therefore far longer than anyone could bear. When the consecration came at precisely the 42-minute mark, Father Rinaldo's pocket watch confirmed this. Several congregants startled at the sudden ringing of the Sanctus bell. An actual bell, brought from some distant church where such things still mattered. The sound was so sharp, so immediate compared to the colony's usual muffled existence, that young Jory burst into tears. Sister Marguerite fared slightly better, though her relationship with time remained stubbornly linear. She changed bandages by the hour, rather than when needed, her stiff wimple bobbing like a metronome as she worked. Her rosary beads clicked in perfect 5-decade intervals, counting down to prayers that arrived whether anyone wanted them or not. Even her footsteps fell at measured intervals, tapping down the infirmary hallway like a slow but relentless drumbeat. The lepers found both caretakers curiously exhausting. Their very presence seemed to drag time back towards some semblance of normalcy, like a strong current fighting against stagnant water. When Sister Marguerite took over the daily medication distribution, the event suddenly had a fixed hour, 10 o'clock sharp, rather than when the sun hits that crack in the wall, or after old man Hesketh finishes coughing. The imposition of order felt violent, a disruption to the colony's carefully cultivated timelessness. Elias observed how the caretaker's eyes glazed over when residents described their experience of time. Father Rinaldo especially struggled when Marta mentioned remembering the same snowstorm lasting 3 winters. "That's impossible," he snapped, consulting his breviary's calendar as though it might clarify. "Meteorological records show." "Records?" Old man Hesketh cackled. "We ain't the Vatican, Father. Our records is what we remember." The priest's solution was to install a sundial in the central courtyard, a beautiful marble thing shipped at great expense from Florence. It stood proudly for exactly 1 day before the colony's peculiar gravity took hold. By noon the next day, the gnomon's shadow had stopped moving entirely, frozen at an angle that defied both astronomy and common sense. Father Rinaldo spent hours checking his calculations before declaring the instrument defective, unaware that every timekeeping device suffered the same fate here eventually. Sister Marguerite's clocks fared no better. The small pendulum clock she hung in the infirmary ran backwards for 2 days, before stopping at 3:28 and refusing to budge. The hourglass she used to time bandage changes either drained instantly or not at all, the sand clumping mysteriously at the top or bottom, with no apparent transition between states. Even her own body's rhythms betrayed her. Sleep came in unpredictable bursts, hunger struck at odd intervals, and within a month she could no longer reliably guess the hour without consulting some broken timepiece. Only Dr. Velshi adapted with ease. Having arrived decades earlier, or was it last year, he'd long since surrendered to the colony's temporal whims. His treatments happened when they happened. His rounds followed the ebb and flow of suffering rather than any schedule. He often told the new caretakers, "You'll either learn to live without clocks or go mad trying," though neither priest nor nun ever believed him until it was too late. Father Rinaldo's breakdown came during Advent. The wreath's candles were supposed to burn down at precise weekly intervals, marking the progression toward Christmas. But in the colony, the first candle lasted 3 weeks while the second burned out in an afternoon. The third refused to light at all, its wick curling away from matches like a living thing. When the priest finally threw the wreath into the courtyard in frustration, the wax pooled into a shape suspiciously like a laughing face. Sister Marguerite lasted longer by sheer stubbornness. Her medication logbook began showing impossible gaps. Patients receiving doses days apart in one entry, then multiple doses in a single hour in the next. Her carefully maintained schedule for wound cleaning collapsed when she realized the same lesions needed attention she'd just given them, while others remained unchanged for weeks despite being left untreated. The final straw came when she documented changing a bandage on young Livia, only to find the girl's arm had been healed for months. By summer's end, if it was summer, the seasons had grown unreliable since the sundial's arrival. Both caretakers moved through the colony like sleepwalkers. Father Rinaldo's pocket watch now showed all hours simultaneously, its face a blur of overlapping numbers. Sister Marguerite's rosary beads had fused together into a single smooth loop, impossible to count. They began joining the residents in their timeless vigil, sitting for hours watching unmoving shadows, no longer startled when supper came what felt like moments after breakfast. The outside world's timekeepers had finally succumbed to the colony's eternal now. Dr. Velshi welcomed them to the fold with a wry smile, handing each a cup of tea that somehow stayed perfectly warm, regardless of how long they took to drink it. "Took you long enough," he murmured, though whether he meant the adaptation or the literal passage of time, no one could say. And so the guardians of schedule became keepers of the endless present, their carefully constructed timelines unraveling like old bandages. The priests' masses now began when enough people showed up and ended when the wine ran out. The nuns' medications were distributed according to who looked like they needed them rather than any chart. Even the Sanctus Bells ring had grown unpredictable, sometimes sounding before the consecration, sometimes after, sometimes not at all. Father Rinaldo, in his more lucid moments, theorized this was how saints experienced eternity, not as endless time, but as its complete absence. Sister Marguerite just stopped winding her clocks. The colony continued as it always had, outside of hours, beyond calendars, in the perpetual, now that had become its true quarantine. New caretakers would arrive eventually, clutching their watches and schedules, and the cycle would begin anew. But for now, the guardians kept their vigil without counting, without measuring, finally understanding what the lepers had known all along, that time wasn't something that passed here. It was something that simply was. Chapter 12. Children in the land of frozen clocks. Yuri could remember being 6 years old for at least a decade. The summer he turned 6, or maybe it was the summer he decided he was 6, since birthdays blurred together like everything else, had stretched like warm taffy, golden and endless. The same dandelions had stood in the field for years, their white heads refusing to scatter no matter how many times he blew on them. The creek behind the infirmary ran sluggishly, each ripple moving as if through honey, minnows suspended in liquid amber. Even his shadow had grown lazy, stretching across the ground at the same angle, day after day, unchanging as the colony itself. The children's games reflected this frozen time. Hide-and-seek matches lasted for what felt like seasons, the seekers wandering without urgency, the hiders dozing in their hiding spots until moss grew on their knees. A single game of tag could span from breakfast until the stars emerged, though the stars here moved reluctantly, as if dragged across the sky against their will. The jump rope song stretched into infinite verses, the rhymes repeating and folding back on themselves until no one could remember how they'd begun. Their bodies told lies about time. Yori's fingernails grew at the pace of stalactites forming in caves, yet somehow he stood taller each morning, his bones lengthening in sudden bursts that defied the colony's lethargy. The other children experienced similar contradictions. baby teeth clinging stubbornly for years before finally loosening, scrapes that neither healed nor festered but simply existed in perpetual mid-scab. School was an exercise in temporal absurdity. Sister Marguerite's lessons on arithmetic and scripture blurred together into one endless afternoon, the letters on the chalkboard swimming before their eyes as the sun refused to move across the classroom window. The Lord's Prayer could take hours to recite, each word stretching like gum, while entire multiplication tables vanished in the space between blinks. Yori often found himself knowing answers to questions no one remembered asking, the knowledge appearing whole in his mind like fruit suddenly ripened on a branch. The adults spoke of years passing, but the children knew better. The same butterfly had been fluttering near the kitchen garden since before Jory could remember, its wings never fading, never tattering. The same cloud hung suspended above the northern field, a sheep-shaped smudge that refused to drift with whatever lazy wind occasionally stirred the grass. Even Decay moved differently for them. The apple core Jory had tossed behind the storage shed remained stubbornly fresh-looking, while new bruises appeared on his shins without any memory of falls. Christmas was the cruelest joke. The anticipation should have made time slow further, but instead the holiday arrived with alarming suddenness. Decorations appearing overnight as if conjured, the same dried oranges and holly berries from previous years, looking no different. The presents, handmade dolls, whittled toys, seemed both brand new and ancient, their wood already worn smooth by phantom hands. Carols were sung in rounds that never quite resolved, the final notes always hovering just out of reach. Illness moved differently for them too. Fevers lasted lifetimes, each sweat-soaked night containing centuries of tossing. Yet recovered, they could never say how long they'd been sick. A day? A month? The red marks around their quarantine cots faded almost immediately, leaving no evidence of how long they'd actually been confined. Only their drawings showed the truth. Yori's sketches of the colony revealed buildings that leaned at impossible angles, trees whose branches spiraled like frozen smoke, faces stretched long as if viewed through melted glass. The other children's artwork displayed similar distortions, suns with too many rays, rain falling upward, clocks whose hands formed perfect spirals with no beginning or end. When shown to adults, these pictures elicited uneasy laughter and quick changes of subject. The few children who'd come from outside struggled most. Livia, who remembered a world where clocks worked and seasons changed on schedule, often sat staring at the unmoving sundial, her fingers twitching as if counting invisible seconds. She still asked, "What time is it?" Long after the others had abandoned the concept, her voice growing increasingly desperate when no one could answer. At night she would whisper to Jory about things called hours and minutes, magical incantations that had once made the world move properly. Puberty arrived without warning, another of time's tricks. One moment they were small enough to hide in the grain barrels. The next they were towering over Sister Marguerite, their voices cracking mid-word as if years had passed in the space of a sentence. The girl's braids seemed to grow overnight, coiling on the floor like snakes, while the boy's chins sprouted fuzz that was there and then wasn't between one glance and the next. The adults pretended not to notice these temporal stutters. When Jory mentioned remembering the same snowstorm 3 winters running, Old Man Hesketh just shrugged and said, "Snow was like that sometimes." When Livia cried that her birthday couldn't have come again so soon, Marta simply cut another slice of cake and told her to enjoy being 12. Only Elias seemed to understand, his watchmaker's soul recognizing the broken gears of their existence, though even his explanations made little sense. "Time isn't broken," he'd say. "It's just bored." As the unchanging years piled up, the children developed their own ways of marking time's passage. They collected fallen eyelashes in jars, each one representing something between a day and a lifetime. They tied knots in strings hanging from their bedposts, but whether the knots marked weeks or simply moments worth remembering, no one could say. Yori kept a stone under his pillow, turning it over each night, a ritual that gave the illusion of progression even as everything remained stubbornly the same. By the time they reached what should have been adulthood, The colony's temporal distortion had seeped into their bones. They moved with the same unhurried pace as their elders, spoke with the same drawn-out cadence, blinked at the same glacial rate. Visitors from outside marveled at how old their eyes looked in such young faces, unaware they were seeing the truth. These were ancient souls who had lived entire lifetimes in what the calendar insisted were mere years. Livia eventually stopped asking about clocks. Yori forgot the taste of minutes. Together they joined the colony's endless vigil, watching the unmoving sun, the static clouds, the hands of broken clocks that pointed forever at the same meaningless hour. The children had become what they were always destined to be, keepers of the frozen moment, inhabitants of the eternal now, their lives measured not in years but in the slow, inexorable creep of shadows that never actually moved. But new children arrived occasionally, wide-eyed and still believing in time. They would learn. They always did. The colony had forever to teach them. Chapter 13. The Alchemy Awaiting. The residents of the leper colony had become philosophers of patience, alchemists of the endless hour. Their survival depended not on medicine or miracles, but on the careful transmutation of waiting into something resembling purpose. Each had developed private rituals to shape time's formless flow, turning leaden minutes into gold-flecked moments worth remembering. Old Man Hesketh's method involved whittling the same piece of wood for 37 years. The block of oak had originally been intended to become a duck, then simplified to a fish when his fingers began failing, then reduced further to an abstract shape that changed daily without ever progressing. The shavings piled around his chair like snowdrifts, their scent marking the seasons he no longer tracked. He couldn't say why he kept at it, only that the rhythm of blade against grain gave the illusion of forward motion, and illusions were all they had left. Marta had perfected the art of the never-ending quilt. What began as a practical project had evolved into a grand philosophical exercise, each stitch placed with contemplative precision. The pattern grew more complex as the years passed, intricate spirals giving way to impossible geometries that hurt the eyes to follow. She'd undo entire sections upon discovering a single misaligned thread, not from perfectionism, but because the unraveling provided more hours of occupation than the sewing. The quilt now covered most of her hut's eastern wall, its edges creeping toward the ceiling at the pace of continents drifting. Elias maintained his collection of broken timepieces with monastic devotion. Though he'd long abandoned any pretense of repair, he developed an elaborate rotation system. Each morning he would select 3 watches to disassemble completely, then spend the day mixing their components into impossible hybrid mechanisms. The results never functioned, often lacking essential parts he'd deliberately left out, but the process itself was the point. A properly complicated gear train could consume weeks of attention, and when finally assembled, its glorious uselessness provided its own satisfaction. The younger residents favored more active distractions. Thomas organized elaborate treasure hunts with clues that referenced events from years past, forcing participants to sift through layers of half-remembered history. The searches often lasted months, the clues themselves becoming artifacts for future games. Livia cultivated a garden of time-sensitive plants, morning glories that took weeks to open, night-blooming cereus that hesitated for years before revealing their flowers. Yori built increasingly complex domino arrangements that snaked through the entire colony, left standing for months until someone finally triggered the cascade. Even meal preparation became a temporal art form. The colony's bakers kneaded their dough for hours beyond necessity, finding solace in the repetitive motion. Soups simmered for days, the flavors deepening as the broth reduced to near nothingness, then being reconstituted again and again. A single pot of stew might see 5 generations of vegetables come and go, the recipe evolving so gradually that no one noticed the changes. Religious observance took on new dimensions. Father Rinaldo's masses now included extended silences between phrases, the spaces between words stretching to accommodate the colony's dilated sense of time. The rosary became an all-day endeavor, each bead receiving minutes of contemplation before moving to the next. Biblical passages about patience and endurance took on fresh significance, their meanings expanding to fill the available hours. The infirmary developed its own temporal therapies. Dr. Velshi prescribed meticulous bandage-folding exercises for restless hands, the precise origami-like folds consuming entire afternoons. Patients with fading sensation were given bowls of mixed grains to separate, the work providing both physical therapy and mental occupation. The slow unraveling of surgical stitches became a meditative practice, each clipped thread marking a tiny victory over entropy. Sleep rituals grew elaborate in their own right. Residents counted not sheep but memories, reviewing entire years in excruciating detail before permitting themselves rest. Others told themselves stories that stretched across weeks, adding new subplots and characters as needed to prolong the narrative. A few simply lay awake, watching the play of moonlight across their walls, tracking patterns that may or may not have existed. The children's adaptations proved most creative. They invented games with rules so complex they required constant revision, the negotiations often outlasting the play itself. Their songs featured endlessly repeating choruses that could continue for hours without resolution. Hide and seek evolved into a days-long theater of evasion, with some participants forgetting they were even playing until discovered by accident. Visitors often mistook these practices for madness, failing to understand their vital purpose. What outsiders saw as pointless repetition, the colonists knew to be sacred alchemy, the transformation of empty time into something with weight and texture. A perfectly folded bandage mattered not for its utility, but for the hours it consumed in the folding. A watch that would never tick again was priceless for the days spent pretending it might. The greatest challenge lay in maintaining these rituals without acknowledging their essential futility. To admit that the quilt would never be finished, that the wood would never take shape, that the watches would never keep time, this way lay despair. So they polished their gears and threaded their needles and watered their gardens with solemn dedication, each action a bulwark against the void of endless tomorrows. As the years piled up like unread newspapers, these rituals became the colony's true architecture, more substantial than the crumbling buildings. They were the scaffolding that made eternity habitable, the delicate clockwork that kept despair at bay. And when newcomers arrived, trembling with the shock of timelessness, it was these arts they were taught first, not how to treat their lesions or stretch their rations, but how to carve meaning from the endless now. For in the leper colony, survival wasn't measured in years or seasons, but in the ability to keep one's hands moving, one's mind occupied, one's hope carefully, deliberately unfurling like Marta's quilt, always growing, never finished, beautiful precisely because it would never be done. Chapter 14. When Tomorrow Never Comes. The future had died quietly in the leper colony, without ceremony or mourning. It happened gradually, plans shrinking from years to months to weeks, then finally dissolving into the perpetual haze of Nod. No one marked the exact moment when next summer became an abstraction, when I get better stopped being a prayer and started being a joke told in bad taste. The disease had taken many things from them, but its cruelest theft was the very concept of waterai. Elias noticed it first in the way people stopped repairing their homes. A leaky roof that would have taken a day to fix in the outside world dripped for years in the colony, the rhythm of falling water marking time more reliably than any clock. When questioned, residents would shrug and say soon, but the word had lost all meaning, a placeholder for intentions that would never materialize. Conversations withered into the present tense. No one spoke of harvests to come or winters they would survive. Children stopped asking what they would be when they grew up, having learned that growing up was not so much a promise as a rumor. Even the simplest future-facing statements, "I'll see you at supper, let's talk tomorrow," felt like lies, empty courtesies from a world that still believed in linear time. The supply cart's monthly visits became the only tether to chronological thinking. When the driver asked, "Will you need more bandages next time?" the question hung in the air like an impossible riddle. Dr. Velshi eventually took to nodding automatically, though both men knew the answer meant nothing. The future was a language they'd all forgotten how to speak. Marta's quilt project illustrated the phenomenon perfectly. What began as "I'll finish it by winter" became perhaps "this section will be done soon," and finally dissolved into simply "this is the quilt." The concept of completion had vanished. The work existed only in its perpetual doing, its borders expanding infinitely like the colony's endless present. Festivals lost their anticipatory joy. Where once the harvest festival had been preceded by weeks of excited preparation, now decorations appeared at the last possible moment, if at all, as if acknowledging that preparation required faith in a future that might not arrive. The children still enjoyed the events, but their laughter had the desperate quality of people trying to ignore an approaching storm. Even pain changed its nature. Where acute suffering once carried the implicit promise of eventual relief, now each ache settled in like a permanent tenant. Thomas's rotting molar wasn't something that would be pulled next week. It was simply part of him now, another feature of the unchanging landscape of his body. People adapted to discomforts that would have been unthinkable in a world with tomorrows, their thresholds reset by eternity. The graveyard should have been future enough for anyone, but even death lost its temporal power. Headstones stopped bearing dates, as no one could agree on what year it was anyway. The freshly turned earth of recent graves looked no different from plots decades old, the colony's strange soil refusing to acknowledge the passage of time. Funerals happened when the body was ready, which could mean anything from immediately to never. Old man Hesketh had been resting in his hut for what might have been weeks or months before someone finally checked. Visitors from outside inevitably asked some variation of "what will you do when?" The question always died unfinished, smothered by the colony's temporal gravity. When the new priest suggested planning for next year's Easter celebration, the silence that followed was so profound he could hear his own pulse. Eventually he stopped making plans too, his carefully maintained liturgical calendar dissolving into the same eternal now that claimed everything else. Only the children occasionally rebelled against this futureless existence. Yori still sometimes whispered to Livia about "when we get out," though neither could articulate where out might be. They played games of make-believe featuring improbable rescues and miraculous cures, their fantasies growing more elaborate as the reality grew bleaker. But even these rebellions faded with time, the weight of the endless present crushing hope's last tendrils. The disease itself mirrored this temporal collapse. Lésions didn't so much worsen as simply continuing, their progression so gradual as to be imperceptible. A foot didn't rot. It was rotting, always rotting, never finished rotting. Pain didn't increase. It persisted, unchanging as the colony itself. Even death, when it came, felt less like an event than the cessation of waiting. Elias' watches told the story most clearly. Where once he'd tinkered with hopes of repair, now he'd disassembled them completely, scattering gears across his workbench like entrails before some ancient oracle. The pieces didn't signify future function. They existed only in their present arrangement, beautiful precisely because they would never again tell time. As the years blurred, the colony's language adapted. The conditional tense vanished first, followed by most future constructions. Even the past grew slippery, stories losing their sequence until all events existed simultaneously. The Great Fire of Eight might be recounted right after yesterday's supper, both equally present in the telling. Visitors found these conversations impossible to follow, like trying to read a book where every page had been shuffled randomly. Yet for all its horrors, this eternal present offered its own perverse comforts. Without futures to fear or pasts to regret, existence simplified into pure being. Hunger was simply hunger, not a harbinger of starvation. Pain was just pain, not a symptom of decline. Even loneliness lost its sting when there had never been any promise of company. When the outside world's wars and revolutions occasionally penetrated the colony's bubble, the news was met with blank stares. What did kings and borders matter in a place where tomorrow never came? The residents would listen politely, then return to their endless now, where the only certainty was the next breath, and the one after that, and the one after that, unto whatever passed for eternity. And so life continued, not in chapters or verses, but in a single endless sentence, punctuated only by the occasional comma of a meal or a nap, or a change of bandages. The sun rose and set, or seemed to, seasons came and went, or might have, and the residents of the leper colony endured, not waiting for death, but simply continuing until it arrived. For in a world without futures, even death lost its meaning as an ending. It was simply the final present, the ultimate now, the last thing that would ever happen in a place where nothing ever really happened at all. Chapter 15. The Last Bell. The notice came on a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday. The distinction no longer mattered in the colony. A crisp government man in a wool suit too heavy for the weather stood in the courtyard and read aloud from an official document, his words snapping like fresh laundry in a stiff wind. By order of the Board of Health, effective immediately, modern treatments rendering quarantine unnecessary. The residents listened in silence, their faces unreadable, their hands resting in their laps like sleeping birds. When the man finished, he looked around expectantly, clearly anticipating tears of joy or grateful embraces. Instead, old man Hesketh spat into the dirt and asked what exactly they were supposed to do now. The question hung in the air, heavier than any official proclamation. Preparations for departure took months that felt like minutes. The colony's temporal distortion fought viciously against this sudden imposition of schedules and deadlines. Packing a single trunk could consume days as residents paused to stare at objects they hadn't touched in decades, each artifact pulling them into memories that had no place in a chronological world. Marta folded her unfinished quilt with infinite care, her fingers tracing patterns that would never be completed. Elias arranged his broken watches in their cases like archaeological treasures, knowing no museum would want them. The children, now grown with children of their own, moved through the compound like ghosts, touching walls that had bounded their entire existence. Livia stood for hours at the broken sundial, as if waiting for its shadow to finally move. Yori sat on the chapel steps counting his pulse, trying to reconcile its steady rhythm with the arrhythmic thrum of colony time that still beat in his veins. When the first automobile arrived to transport them to the sanatorium, no one boarded. They watched from the porches as the driver honked and checked his watch, his impatience a foreign language. It took days before Tomas finally shuffled forward, his remaining fingers clutching a suitcase containing everything he owned. The others followed in slow procession, each step an act of temporal defiance. The sanatorium's clock tower struck the hour as they arrived, the sound like gunfire after decades of silence. Noses headed them toward disinfection stations, their crisp white uniforms starched into sharp creases that hurt the eyes. Quickly now, they chirped, unaware they were asking the impossible. How did one move quickly when time itself had been broken? Modern medicine proved almost as disorienting as the clocks. Treatments happened at precise intervals, pills at 8, injections at 2, bandage changes at 4. The former colonists blinked at their schedules like ancient scholars confronted with a new alphabet. When a nurse asked Marta to list her medications by order of frequency, she laughed until tears streaked her ruined cheeks. The world outside had transformed beyond recognition. Buildings crowded where fields had been. Motor cars choked streets that once knew only horse carts. Radios chattered constantly, their voices urgent about news that would be obsolete by dinner. Newspapers piled up daily, each edition insisting on the importance of events that had already been forgotten. The cacophony of progress left the colonists numb and trembling, their senses overloaded by a century's changes compressed into what the calendar insisted was only a few decades. Livia tried working in a textile factory but quit when the foreman shouted about production quotas. The looms moved too fast, their shuttles blurring like hummingbird wings. She missed the deliberate pace of Marta's quilting circle where a single stitch could be contemplated for hours. Yori lasted a week, as a watchmaker's apprentice before smashing a delicate chronograph against the wall. "It's lying!" he screamed as the gears scattered across the floor. The master craftsman didn't understand. No one could that the young man wasn't angry at the mechanism, but at time itself for daring to march so precisely after all those years of glorious stagnation. Only Elias adapted with any success, finding work as a museum caretaker where his methodical pace went unnoticed among the relics. He particularly liked the sundial exhibit, though he often had to resist the urge to adjust them all to colony time. Some couldn't adapt at all. Old man Hesketh refused to leave his sanatorium bed after learning his family's farm had become a department store. Thomas wandered into traffic trying to count the seconds between motor cars. Marta spent her days staring at a wall calendar, paralyzed by the terrifying freedom of empty squares waiting to be filled. At night, when the sanatorium quieted, they would gather in the courtyard and try to remember how time used to feel. Someone would mention the endless summer of 32, the winter that lasted a decade, and for a moment their breathing would synchronize into the old, familiar rhythm. The stars above were the same at least, though even they seemed to move faster now. When the last bell finally rang, not the sanatorium's mechanical clangor, but a small handbell Elias had salvaged from the colony, only a handful remained to hear it. They passed it around, each giving it a gentle shake, the sound softer than memory, but truer than any clock. There were no speeches, no toasts. They simply sat together as the minutes stretched in that old, familiar way, one final gift from the place that had broken time for them. Then morning came, as mornings do, and with it the nurses and the schedules and the relentless forward march of hours. The former colonists rose to meet it as they always had, not with hope or despair, but with the quiet endurance of people who had outlasted eternity itself. Somewhere in the city, a clock struck the hour, its tone bright and meaningless. The last bell had rung. Time, real time, had finally come for them all. Chapter 16. Modern Echoes of Temporal Distortion. The world had changed, but time's peculiar elasticity remained. As Elias rode the elevator to his tiny apartment each evening, he noticed how his fellow passengers avoided eye contact in the same way colony residents once had. Not out of shame, but from an unspoken understanding that prolonged contact might reveal too much about their shared temporal dislocation. The elevator's digital display counted floors with relentless precision, yet the ride always felt either interminably long or suspiciously brief. Modern isolation took different forms, but its effects on time perception followed familiar patterns. Office workers drifting through endless Zoom calls understood how an hour-long meeting could simultaneously drag and vanish without trace. Parents confined during maternity leave recognized the colony's temporal paradox, days that lasted forever, yet months that disappeared between blinks. The quarantined, the hospitalized, the homebound, all became reluctant initiates into that same timeless space the lepers had inhabited for centuries. Elias saw the parallels everywhere. His neighbor, Mrs. Kwong, confined to her apartment after hip surgery, had developed a quilt project strikingly similar to Marta's, except hers was digital. Pixelated squares rearranged endlessly on a tablet screen. Across the hall, a software engineer named Raj kept 27 broken smartwatches in a drawer, occasionally taking them out to admire their frozen displays. Neither recognized these behaviors as anything but personal quirks, unaware they were reenacting ancient coping mechanisms. The children's temporal dislocation had modern counterparts, too. Elias often watched the teenagers in his building, their faces illuminated by smartphone glow, scrolling through feeds that collapsed past, present, and future into one endless stream. They complained of time blindness with the same bewildered frustration Jory once expressed when trying to understand clocks. The digital natives moved through chronological time like foreigners in an unfamiliar land, their internal rhythms better suited to the colony's elastic hours than to the world's rigid scheduling. Hospitals became inadvertent preserves of colony time. Patience described how night shifts stretched into eternities, while whole weeks vanished between rounds of chemotherapy. Nurses developed the same resigned patience Dr. Velshi had displayed, understanding that healing followed its own mysterious timeline. The chronically ill-formed quiet communities where, "What day is it?" was met with sympathetic laughter rather than answers. Prisons, nursing homes, refugee camps, all became accidental inheritors of the colony's temporal distortion. Inmatis marked time by meals rather than calendars, the way the lepers once did. Elderly residents experienced holidays arriving with jarring suddenness, just as the colony's festivals had. Displaced persons in temporary shelters found themselves suspended in the same endless present, where next week held as little meaning as it had behind the colony walls. Even modern workplaces echoed the phenomenon. The cubicle dwellers' Monday morning felt indistinguishable from the lepers' eternal now, both trapped in cycles of repetition without progression. Office birthdays arrived with the same surreal frequency as the colony's misaligned celebrations. Performance reviews loomed like the supply cart's visits, artificial punctuations in time's seamless flow. Elias found the most striking parallel in the way modern society had developed its own temporal alchemies. Streaming services offered endless content to fill sleepless nights, the digital equivalent of Marta's quilt. Social media provided the illusion of productivity through mindless scrolling, not unlike whittling the same piece of wood for decades. Smartphone notifications chopped time into colony-sized fragments, each ping pulling attention away from the unbearable stretch of empty minutes. The pandemic lockdowns made the similarities undeniable. Suddenly millions understood how days could blur together, how weeks could pass without milestones, how time could simultaneously crawl and race. People planted sourdough starters with the same desperate hope the lepers had cultivated their gardens. Zoom happy hours mirrored the colony's strained attempts at celebration. The entire world briefly lived in the leper colony's temporal reality, though few recognized the kinship. Even after restrictions lifted, some temporal scars remained. Office workers struggled to readjust to commutes after months of elastic schedules. Students found classroom clocks move differently than the ones in their bedrooms. The previously incarcerated spoke of struggling with outside time, just as the former lepers had. Elias took small comfort in these echoes. When his new digital watch glitched and showed all hours simultaneously, he smiled at the old familiar confusion. When his doctor complained about his inconsistent medication schedule, he almost explained about colony time before thinking better of it. The modern world had built countless tools to measure and manage time, yet remained helpless against its fundamental fluidity. Smartwatches counted steps but couldn't make the walk feel shorter. Calendar apps reminded people of appointments but couldn't make the waiting easier. The ancient struggle against time's subjectivity continued, just with better technology. At night, when the city's noise faded slightly, Elias would sometimes take out one of his salvaged colony watches. He'd hold it to his ear, listening for ticks that would never come, remembering how time used to feel when it was broken properly. The silence comforted him. A relic from an era when humanity's relationship with time was at least honestly strange, rather than this exhausting pretense of control. The modern world had cured the leprosy of isolation, but not its temporal consequences. People remained trapped in their own invisible colonies, struggling to reconcile internal time with external demands. The clocks all worked now, but time itself remained as stubbornly elastic as ever. And as Elias set his perfectly functioning alarm each night, he took perverse comfort in knowing that when it rang too early the next morning, that groan of protest rising in his chest would be the exact same sound old man Hesketh made when the supply cart arrived before he was ready. Some things, it seemed, never changed, no matter how carefully you measured them. Chapter 17. A Pocket Watch in the Colony. Mr. Pembroke arrived at the colony with 12 suitcases and a gold pocket watch that kept perfect time. This last accessory made him immediately the most fascinating and reviled resident in the settlement's history. The watch was a beautiful thing, Swiss-made, with a hunter case that snapped open with a satisfying click, revealing porcelain face and delicate black hands that moved with relentless precision. It had survived the journey from London untouched by the colony's temporal malaise, its gears whirring as efficiently as if it still sat in some Mayfair gentleman's club rather than this timeless purgatory. For the first week, the other residents watched in awe as Pembroke consulted his timepiece with aristocratic nonchalance. 3:30, he'd declare when asked the hour, or nearly supper time, as though these phrases held any meaning in a place where clocks rusted into stillness and meal times occurred when hunger overcame inertia. His certainty was mesmerizing, his temporal confidence radiating like cologne too strong for the cramped quarters. The problems began when others started relying on his pronouncements. Old man Hesketh took to setting his daily nap by Pembroke's watch, only to find himself wide awake at what the timepiece claimed was bedtime. Marta attempted to time her quilt stitching by the watch's measurements, growing increasingly frustrated when her progress failed to match the elapsed minutes. Even Dr. Velshi, normally immune to such preoccupations, found himself checking wound dressings more frequently, convinced by the watch's insistence that hours had passed when his body swore only minutes had. The watch's tyranny reached its peak during mealtimes. Pembroke began insisting the colony adhere to a strict schedule: breakfast at 8, noon dinner, supper at 6, as if the arbitrary numbers on his little machine could override decades of culinary anarchy. The cooks rebelled first, deliberately burning meals that arrived too early at the pot, letting others grow cold when the watch declared it wasn't yet time. Children took to hiding Pembroke's timepiece in creative locations, buried in the flour bin, dangling from the outhouse roof, once even submerged in a bucket of milk where it ticked merrily beneath the cream line. The watch always resurfaced, usually in Pembroke's own pocket as if by magic, its hands having somehow kept perfect time during its absence. Its resilience became the stuff of colony legend. When tossed down the well, it was found ticking in the bucket the next morning. When left out during a rainstorm, its gears continued turning beneath droplets that seemed to hang motionless above its face. Even the colony's temporal distortion couldn't touch this pristine instrument of chronological tyranny. Elias, as the closest thing to a horological expert, became the reluctant mediator in what became known as the Time Wars. He tried explaining to Pembroke that his watch, while mechanically perfect, was philosophically incompatible with colony life. "Time isn't absolute here," he said, waving at the frozen sundial. "It's more of a suggestion." Pembroke scoffed. "Nonsense. Time is time. This watch kept perfect time for my father and his father before him." He snapped the case shut with finality, the click echoing like a judge's gavel. The conflict came to a head during the harvest festival. Pembroke insisted the celebrations begin precisely at 2 o'clock, according to his watch. The colonists, operating on their usual elastic schedule, straggled in throughout what the timepiece claimed was late afternoon. When the dancing finally began, Pembroke stood fuming at the edge of the festivities, consulting his watch every 30 seconds, as if expecting the universe to correct itself. It was little Jory who finally broke the timepiece's spell. During a particularly raucous reel, he accidentally collided with Pembroke, sending the watch sailing into the fire pit. The colonists watched in hushed anticipation as flames licked the golden case, waiting for the inevitable explosion of springs and gears that would end this temporal insurrection. Instead, something far stranger occurred. The watch emerged unscathed the next morning, resting atop the cooled ashes as if placed there by careful hands. Its glass was unbroken, its metal untarnished, its hands now frozen at 11:07, the exact moment Pembroke had first entered the colony gates. From that day forward, the watch remained stubbornly stopped, becoming just another broken chronometer in a settlement full of them. Pembroke took to carrying it anyway, its weight a comforting reminder of the world where time had rules. Occasionally he'd press it to his ear out of habit, then sigh at the silence within. The other residents pretended not to notice when the watch's hands began moving again, Just slightly, barely enough to perceive. No one mentioned how it gained exactly 1 minute every colony year, keeping its own peculiar time in quiet rebellion against eternity. And if sometimes, in the deep night, its ticking could be heard echoing through the settlement, well, that was just the wind, wasn't it? Just the wind and memory, and the persistent human delusion that time could ever truly be kept. Chapter 18. The Archaeologist's Discovery. Dr. Eleanor Shaw's trowel scraped against something metallic beneath 2 centuries of accumulated soil. The dig site, what remained of the old leper colony, had yielded few artifacts until now. Her graduate students gathered around as she carefully brushed dirt from the object, revealing the porcelain face of a pocket watch, frozen at 11:07. The hands seemed to tremble under her touch, though that was surely just a trick of the late afternoon light. The discovery would have been unremarkable. Colonial sites often turned up timepieces, were it not for the journal found nearby. The brittle pages, preserved by some quirk of the acidic soil, contained meticulous observations from someone identified only as E. Entries spanned what should have been decades, yet the handwriting showed no signs of aging. Even stranger, the dates jumped erratically. May 1783 followed directly by August 1789, then back to March 1784, as if the writer had experienced time in a different order than the calendar suggested. Shaw's team catalogued other peculiar finds as the dig progressed. A sundial buried upside down beneath the chapel foundation, its gnomon bent at an impossible angle. Dozens of watches and clock parts, all stopped at various times, many showing evidence of deliberate dismantling. Most disturbing were the children's slates, where careful penmanship exercises abruptly dissolved into spiraling patterns that made viewers dizzy if stared at too long. The medical records proved most revealing. Dr. Velchi's case notes described treatments administered when the moon was right or after the proper waiting period, with no specific dates. Patient deterioration was measured not in weeks or months, but in stages that seemed to correspond more to psychological acceptance than biological progression. A notation for one resident simply read, "Time of death, eventually." Back at the university, carbon dating yielded impossible results. The pocket watch's inner mechanisms tested as 200 years old, while its casing appeared brand new. Fabric samples from the quilt Marta had never finished showed threads from drastically different eras woven together. Even the building's nails defied explanation, some rusted to nothing, others shockingly pristine despite identical burial condition. Shaw's colleague, a physicist named Chen, became obsessed with the colony's lone surviving clock tower. Though its exterior appeared badly weathered, the interior gears gleamed as if recently oiled. "It's like time moved differently inside this mechanism," Chen muttered during one late-night examination. "The oxidation patterns make no sense unless—" His voice trailed off as he noticed the pendulum, which swung lazily despite the mechanism being completely unwound. The university psychology department contributed their own unsettling findings. Volunteers who handled the artifacts too long reported distorted time perception, watches running backwards, coffee going cold too quickly, that persistent sense of having just missed something important. One graduate student swore she spent an entire afternoon transcribing Elias's journal, only to find her computer clock hadn't moved since lunch. Historical records from surrounding towns added another layer to the mystery. Supply orders from the colony often arrived with impossible lead times, requests dated after the deliveries themselves. Local priests complained in letters about the colony's temporal irregularity when it came to feast days. Most damning was a 1792 merchant's ledger that noted, "Third visit this year to the Lepers, though my wife insists I went just last month." Shaw's team began experiencing temporal anomalies themselves. Equipment would malfunction only when pointed at certain artifacts. Dig logs showed entries in handwriting no team member recognized. One intern swore he saw the pocket watch's hands move during documentation, though the video footage showed only static. The final piece fell into place when they uncovered Elias's workshop. Dozens of carefully labeled watch parts were arranged in precise geometric patterns, each component tagged with philosophical musings rather than technical notes. Balance wheel, the illusion of regularity, read 1. Mind spring, time's false promise of tension. A half-assembled mechanism at the center bore the inscription, "For measuring eternity, should it ever arrive." Press coverage brought unwanted attention. Newspaper headlines screamed about time-warp lepers and the colony that forgot to age. Television psychics claimed the site was a portal to other dimensions. Shaw found herself giving increasingly terse interviews, trying to steer focus back to the historical significance while ignoring her own growing unease. The university decided to end the dig after the midnight incident, when the security cameras allegedly showed figures moving through the excavated ruins despite the site being empty. Artifacts were catalogued and stored, papers were published, and slowly the world lost interest in the colony's temporal mysteries. But sometimes, late in her campus office, Shaw would take out the pocket watch from its archival case. She'd hold it to her ear, listening for ticks that never came, yet somehow feeling the weight of all those frozen moments. Her colleagues joked that she'd developed leper time, showing up to meetings either absurdly early or embarrassingly late, her wristwatch perpetually set to the wrong hour. The last journal entry in Elias's notebook, dated simply eventually, provided the only explanation anyone would ever get. We did not live outside of time, but within its flaws. Like the gap between gears, the space where teeth fail to meet, that is where we made our... Chapter 19. Lessons from the Time Forgotten. The world rushed forward in its endless hurry, but the ghost of the colony lingered in the silent spaces between seconds. Modern life had become a frantic race against clocks that never rested, productivity metrics that climbed forever upward, and digital notifications that sliced attention into ever thinner slivers. Yet those who studied the leper colony's strange relationship with time found themselves questioning this endless chase. Psychologists marveled at how the colonists had maintained sanity in timeless isolation. Their coping mechanisms, repetitive crafts, unstructured socializing, acceptance of idle moments, became subjects of research papers on resilience. Therapists began prescribing colony time exercises. Patients instructed to spend whole afternoons doing nothing but watching clouds or listening to their own breath. The results shocked the medical community. Depression scores dropped, anxiety levels stabilized, and for the first time in years, people reported feeling truly rested. Corporate wellness programs attempted to co-opt these findings with laughable results. Mandatory slow hours, where employees stared at screensavers of pastoral landscapes, only highlighted how thoroughly modern work culture had corrupted the concept of rest. A tech startup's Leper Colony Fridays, no meetings, no deadlines, collapsed when managers demanded productivity metrics for the unstructured time. The true lessons emerged in unexpected places. Nursing homes introduced timeless zones where clocks were removed, and meals came when hunger struck rather than by schedule. Residents thrived, their confusion easing as the artificial pressure of mechanical hours lifted. Hospitals created recovery wards without visible clocks, finding patients needed less pain medication when not anxiously counting minutes between doses. Parents of special needs children discovered the colony's wisdom organically. Those caring for autistic or ADHD kids had long known about time blindness. Now they found kinship with people for whom watches had been instruments of torture rather than tools. Households abandoned rigid schedules in favor of natural rhythms, discovering that children could indeed regulate themselves when not constantly harried by arbitrary transitions. Wow! The artistic world embraced temporal distortion most enthusiastically. Composers created pieces that stretched single notes across minutes, the vibration settling into listeners' bones. Painters layered images that blurred chronological sequence, seedling, flower, and wilted stem existing simultaneously on canvas. Novelists experimented with narratives that meandered like colony afternoons, where plot mattered less than immersion in a moment. Even the digital world, that great accelerator of human attention, found itself influenced. App developers created Leper mode settings that disabled notifications and replaced timers with gentle, unmeasured prompts. Social media platforms introduced endless scroll features without timestamps or posted X hours ago markers, allowing posts to exist in pure context rather than chronological competition. Historians noted the irony. Modern society had finally achieved the colonists' forced isolation voluntarily. Office workers telecommuting in pajamas, students attending virtual lectures from bed, families ordering groceries to avoid crowded stores. All were living variations of the colony's removed existence. The key difference, researchers emphasized, was that the lepers had surrendered to their timelessness rather than fighting it with scheduling apps and productivity hacks. Elias' journals, once seen as the ramblings of a mad watchmaker, were reprinted as philosophical texts. His musings on the tyranny of measured time resonated with a generation drowning in calendar invites and micromanaged routines. Passages about broken clocks being more honest than functioning ones appeared on inspirational posters alongside mountains and platitudes about journeys. The most profound impact came in how people approached mortality. The colonists' acceptance of decay as simply another rhythm rather than an enemy became a model for terminal patients rejecting aggressive treatments. Hospices adopted colony time principles, focusing on presence rather than prolonging at all costs. Funeral homes began offering services without clocks or schedules, allowing grief to unfold at its natural pace. Of course, modern life couldn't fully surrender to timelessness. Trains still needed schedules, surgeries required precise coordination, and children, mostly, attended school at regular hours. But in the cracks between these necessities, the colony's wisdom took root. People began questioning why meetings needed to be exactly 60 minutes, why birthdays required annual celebration rather than whenever felt right, why life had to be segmented into rigid blocks at all. The pocket watch from the dig eventually found a home in a museum exhibit titled The Fiction of Time. Visitors lingered unusually long before its case, some reporting strange experiences, watches stopping as they viewed it, phones malfunctioning, that eerie sense of expanded moments. Security cameras recorded hundreds of people checking their wrists instinctively after walking away, as if to confirm time still moved normally beyond the artifact's influence. Perhaps the colony's greatest lesson was this: time had always been more subjective than clocks admitted. The lepers' tragedy wasn't that they lost track of hours, but that the world outside forgot how fluid time could be. In their isolation, they discovered what modern society was only now remembering, that moments matter more than their measurement, that presence outweighs punctuality, and that sometimes the richest lives are those not counted in years, but lived in breaths. As cities grew quieter during evening slow hours and workplaces embraced timeless Thursdays, as parents stopped rushing children and doctors listened rather than glanced at clocks, the colony's legacy quietly rewrote humanity's relationship with time. Not as master to servant, not as prisoner to warden, but as companions in an endless dance where sometimes, just sometimes, the music slowed enough to actually hear the melody. And if occasionally in certain light the pocket watch in its museum case seemed to tremble toward motion, well, that was likely just a trick of the exhibition light. Certainly the curator's insistence that it now showed 11:8 rather than 11:7 was an error in the original documentation. Time might be flexible, but it didn't actually rewrite itself. Did it? Chapter 20. The Eternal Hourglass. The sand does not fall in the hourglass, it pools. It gathers in the lower bulb like memories collecting in the hollows of the mind, each grain indistinguishable from the next, forming a mound that should measure time, but instead denies it. The colonists knew this truth instinctively. They lived inside that hourglass, where gravity was a suggestion rather than a law, where the flow of moments could thicken like honey or vanish like breath on a cold morning. Modern science confirms what the lepers understood in their bones. Time is not a river but a tapestry, woven with threads that twist and double back, that knot unexpectedly or stretch thin as mist. A clock measures nothing but its own mechanics, its ticks as arbitrary as the human pulse, which races or slows depending on fear, love, or the simple act of breathing. The pocket watch in the museum still reads 11:7, though records show it was found stopped at 11:8. Visitors argue about this discrepancy, unaware they are repeating an old colony joke, the one about the man who insisted his watch was right twice a day, only to realize that in the colony even that was optimistic. The debate itself is the lesson. Time is not fact, but folklore, a story we agree to tell ourselves so the world makes sense. Children understand this instinctively. A summer day lasts forever. A school year passes in a blink. Grown-ups forget until pain reminds them. The endless wait in a hospital corridor, the way grief stretches a single second into an epoch, the surreal speed with which decades vanish when looking backward. The lepers, exiled from chronological pretense, had no choice but to become philosophers of this elasticity. Their quarantine was not just from society, but from the illusion of measured time. Now, as the world rediscovers their wisdom, something peculiar happens. Office workers pause mid-task, suddenly aware of their own breathing. Parents let bedtime slide to watch fireflies with their children. Clocks still tick, calendars still turn. But the tyranny of their precision weakens. The colony's temporal rebellion spreads quietly, not as revolution but as revelation, an understanding that moments matter more when not counted. Elias' journals end with an unfinished thought. If time is a fabric, then perhaps we are the threads, not the weavers. His broken watches, now displayed beside the infamous pocket watch, seem to whisper this truth to those who linger. Some visitors swear the hands twitch when no one is looking. The museum guards no longer dismiss these claims. They've seen it too. In the end, the colony's greatest gift was this, the realization that all human lives exist in their own hourglass. Some feel the sand rushing, others watch it pool, motionless, for what seems like eternity. Neither perception is wrong. The lepers, forced to live outside time's fiction, discovered what the rest of us glimpse only in dreams or emergencies. That the present is all we truly inhabit, whether it lasts a second or a lifetime. And so the hourglass remains, somewhere between flow and stagnation, between 11:7 and 11:8, between then and now and whatever comes next. Its glass holds not sand, but something finer, the dust of moments, light as thought, heavy as memory, shifting restlessly in a shape that almost, but never quite resembles the passage of time. The colony is gone. Its lessons linger. Time, as always, is optional.